Well now, child, settle yourself down real comfortable like in that chair, 'cause old Granny Abby's got herself a tale tonight that's different from all the others I've told you over the years. This ain't no story about strangers bringing curses to town or mysterious happenings that befell other folks in distant places. No sir, this here's a story that cuts closer to home than a razor on Sunday morning. This is about our own family, about blood that runs in your veins and mine, you see. I've been telling stories in this old rocking chair for nigh on 60 years now, sharing tales of the frontier days when the West was wild and untamed. When good and evil walked hand in hand down dusty main streets, and a person's character was measured by how they faced the DA. Rookness when it came calling. But there's one story I ain't never told, one secret I've kept locked away in my heart like a precious jewel in a strongbox. It's the story of my grandmother, your great-great-grandmother, a woman whose name was spoken in whispers long after she passed from this world. Her name was Constance May Whitmore, but folks who knew her in the old days called her by another name entirely. A name that could make grown men cross themselves and women clutch their children closer to their skirts. Now, you might wonder why I ain't never told you about Constance before, seeing as how I'm always going on about family history and the importance of knowing where you come from. The truth is, child, some stories are like wild animals. They're dangerous when they're caged up, but they're even more dangerous when you let them loose. I've been wrestling with this particular story for decades, wondering if it was better left buried with the woman who lived it, but lately I've been having dreams, vivid dreams where Constance herself comes to me, looking just like she did in the old daguerreotype I keep hidden in my jewelry box. She's wearing that black dress she favored, the one with the silver buttons that caught the light like stars in a midnight sky. Her hair is pulled back severe-like, and her eyes, Lord have mercy, those eyes are the same pale green that you inherited, child. The same eyes that have marked the women in our family for generations. In these dreams, she speaks to me in that voice I remember from my childhood, soft but commanding, like velvet wrapped around steel. Abigail, she says, the time has come to tell the truth. The family needs to know what they're carrying in their blood, what legacy they've inherited, along with those green eyes and that stubborn streak that runs through our line like a vein of silver through Rock. I always wake up from these dreams with my heart pounding like a war drum and my hands shaking like autumn leaves in a windstorm, because I know she's right. I know that keeping this secret ain't protecting anyone, it's just letting the darkness fester like an infected wound that never gets the chance to heal proper. You see, Constance May Whitmore wasn't just any pioneer woman trying to make a life on the frontier. She was something else entirely, something that most folks wouldn't understand and couldn't accept if they did. She had what the old-timers called the gift, the ability to see things that others couldn't see, to know things that others couldn't know, to touch the world beyond the veil that separates the living from the dead. But gifts like that come with a price, child, they always do. And the price that Constance paid for her abilities was higher than anyone should ever have to bear. It cost her everything she loved, everyone she cared about, and very nearly cost her her soul. This is the story she made me promise never to tell. The story that's been eating away at me like acid for all these years. It's the story of how our family came to be marked by tragedy and loss, how we came to carry a burden that's been passed down from mother to daughter for generations now. It's the story of the day Constance May Whitmore made a deal with something that should never be bargained with, and how that deal changed the fate of everyone who came after her. So pour yourself some coffee, child, and prepare yourself for a tale that'll make you understand why I've been so protective of you all these years, why I've always warned you To be careful with that gift you inherited. Why, I've always told you that some doors are better left unopened. This is the story my grandmother never wanted told. But it's time for the truth to come out into the light where it belongs. It was the winter of 1862 when everything changed for Constance May Whitmore. When a blizzard unlike any the territory had ever seen came howling down from the mountains like the very half of hell itself. I was just a little girl, then maybe 7 years old, but I remember that storm clear as crystal because it was the night my baby brother died. And the night my grandmother made the choice that would haunt our family for generations too. We were living in a cabin about 20 miles north of what would later become the town of Cedar Ridge, in country so remote that our nearest neighbor was a full day's ride away. My grandfather, Ezekiel Whitmore, had built that cabin with his own hands, cutting every log and driving every nail with the kind of determination that only comes from a man who's trying to carve at a life for his family in a land that don't want to be tamed. It was just the four of us in that little cabin: grandfather Ezekiel, grandmother Constance, my father William, who was barely 18 at the time, and me. My baby brother Samuel had been born just 3 months prior, in the early days of autumn when the leaves were turning gold and red like nature's own celebration of new life. Samuel was the light of Constance's life. Child, I'd never seen a woman love a baby the way she loved that little boy. She'd hold him for hours, singing old songs her own mother had taught her back in Missouri. Songs about angels watching over sleeping children and love that lasts beyond the grave. Her eyes would get all soft and dreamy when she looked at him, like she was seeing something the rest of us couldn't see. But Samuel was a sickly child from the start, born too small and too weak. Struggling to draw breath like every lungful of air was a battle he wasn't sure he could win. Doc Henderson, who served the scattered homesteads in our area, had warned us that babies born like Samuel often didn't make it through their first winter. Keep him warm, he'd said, keep him fed, and pray to the Almighty that he's stronger than he looks. The blizzard started on a Tuesday evening in late December, just 3 days before Christmas. At first, it seemed like any other winter storm, wind howling around the cabin, snow piling up against the windows, the kind of weather that makes you grateful for a warm fire and a tight roof over your head. But as the hours passed, it became clear that this was something different, something unnatural. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. Like the voices of the damned crying out for mercy that would never come. The snow didn't just fall, it attacked, driving against the cabin walls with such force that the whole structure shook and groaned like a living thing in pain. The temperature dropped so fast that ice began forming on the inside of the windows, and our breath came out in great white clouds even though we had a roaring fire going in the hearth. But the worst part was the cold that seemed to seep through the very walls themselves, a cold that no amount of firewood could drive away. It was the kind of cold that gets into your bones and stays there. The kind of cold that whispers to you about death and darkness and the futility of fighting against forces beyond your control. By the second day of the storm, little Samuel had taken a turn for the worse. His breathing became labored and shallow, his tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm that sounded like a death rattle. His skin took on a greyish pallor that reminded me of the colour of old snow. And when Constance tried to feed him, he couldn't keep anything down. I watched my grandmother pace the floor of that cabin like a caged animal, her green eyes wild with desperation and fear. She tried everything she knew, warming blankets by the fire, brewing teas from herbs she'd brought from Missouri, even holding the baby against her own body to share her warmth, but nothing worked. Samuel was slipping away from us, and we all knew it. On the third night of the storm, when the wind was howling so loud it sounded like the world was ending, Samuel stopped breathing altogether. Just for a moment, maybe 10 seconds, that felt Like 10 years, his little chest went still and his lips turned blue as winter sky. That's when Constance did something that changed everything. She looked up at the ceiling of that cabin, her face twisted with grief and rage and a determination that was frightening to behold, and she spoke words that no God-fearing woman should ever speak. "I don't care what it costs," she said, her voice cutting through the storm like a knife through silk. "I don't care what price I have to pay or what bargain I have to make. I will not let death take this child. Not tonight. Not ever." And that's when something answered her call, child. Something that had been waiting in the darkness beyond the storm. Something that feeds on desperation and grows strong on the kind of love that refuses to accept loss. Something that was about to change our family's destiny forever. The moment those words left Constance's lips, the very air in our cabin seemed to change. Like the atmosphere before a lightning strike, when every hair on your body stands up and you know something powerful is about to happen, the fire in the hearth flickered and danced in ways that defied the laws of nature, casting shadows on the walls that moved independent of anything that should have been casting them. Little Samuel drew in a shuddering breath, his chest rising and falling once more, but there was something different about him now. His skin, which had been grey as ash just moments before, took on a strange luminescence, like he was glowing from within with some kind of unnatural light. His eyes, when they fluttered open, weren't the soft brown they'd been since birth. They were pale green, the same shade as Constance's own eyes, but with something ancient and knowing lurking in their depths. My grandfather Ezekiel, who'd been sitting silent in his chair, whittling a piece of wood to keep his hands busy during the vigil, suddenly looked up with an expression of pure terror on his weathered face. "Constance," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the howling wind, "what have you done?" But Constance wasn't listening to him. She was staring at something none of the rest of us could see, her eyes fixed on a point just beyond the cabin's main window where the storm raged with unnatural fury. Her lips were moving, but no sound was coming out, or at least, no sound that human ears could hear. It was like she was having a conversation with someone, negotiating terms for a bargain that the rest of us weren't privy to. The temperature in the cabin began to fluctuate wildly. One moment we'd be shivering despite the fire, the next we'd be sweating like it was the middle of July. The wind outside changed its tune. No longer just howling, but seeming to form words in a language that predated human civilization. Syllables that made my teeth ache and my stomach churn with a sickness that had nothing to do with anything physical. My father William, who'd been standing by the window watching the storm, suddenly stumbled backward like he'd been pushed by invisible hands. "Ma," he said to Constance, his young voice cracking with fear, "there's something out there, something moving in the snow, something that ain't natural." I crept to the window myself, being careful to stay low so whatever was out there couldn't see me clearly. What I saw in that swirling white chaos still gives me nightmares 50 years later. There were shapes moving through the blizzard, tall, dark figures that seemed to glide rather than walk, their forms shifting and changing like smoke-given substance. They were circling our cabin, moving in a pattern that reminded me of vultures circling their dying animal, waiting for the right moment to descend and claim their prize. But the most terrifying thing was that they seemed to be waiting for something, some signal or invitation that would allow them to come closer. They stayed just at the edge of our property, just beyond the line where our land met the wild frontier. Like there was some invisible barrier holding them back. That's when I realized what was happening. Constance had called out to something in her desperation, and something had answered. But whatever it was, it couldn't just take what it wanted. It had to be invited in. Had to be given permission to cross the threshold between its world and ours. "The price," Constance suddenly said aloud, her voice strange and hollow like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. "Yes, I understand the price. I accept the terms. Ezekiel jumped up from his chair so fast it toppled over backward, the piece of wood he'd been whittling clattering to the floor. Constance, no, he shouted, grabbing her by the shoulders and shaking her like he was trying to wake her from a dream. Don't you dare make any bargains with whatever's out there. Some things are worse than death, woman. But it was too late. Constance had already made her choice. Sealed her fate with words that couldn't be taken back. She looked at her husband with eyes that were no longer entirely her own, eyes that held knowledge of things no mortal woman should ever know. It's done, Ezekiel, she said. Her voice calm as still water but with an undertone that made my blood run cold. Samuel will live, he'll grow up strong and healthy, and he'll have children of his own someday. The bloodline will continue. And what did you promise in return? Ezekiel asked. Though from the look on his face, I think he already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. Constance smiled then, but it wasn't the warm, loving smile I remembered from before the storm. This was something else entirely, something that belonged on the face of a stranger rather than my own grandmother. Every third generation, she said. Her words falling into the cabin like stones dropped into a still pond. Every third generation. One of our bloodline will serve. One will be chosen to carry on the work, to maintain the balance between the world of the living and the world of the dead. She looked directly at me then. Those pale green eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made me want to hide under the bed like I was still a baby afraid of monsters in the dark. And you, little Abigail, are the third generation. Those words hit me like a physical blow, child, knocking the wind right out of my lungs and making my 7-year-old heart race like a wild Mustang trying to break free from a corral. The third generation, that was me, whatever bargain my grandmother had struck with the dark forces swirling around our cabin that night. I was going to be the one to pay the price for it, but at that moment I was too young to fully understand what it meant. All I knew was that little Samuel was breathing again. His colour had returned to normal, and the terrible grey pallor of death had lifted from his tiny features. He was making soft cooing sounds, the kind of contented noises that healthy babies make when they're warm and safe and loved. The storm outside began to subside almost immediately. Like whatever had been driving it with unnatural fury had gotten what it came for and was now satisfied to move on. The howling wind died down to a whisper, the driving snow gelled to a soft fall, and the temperature in the cabin stabilized to something that felt normal for a winter night in the mountains. But the shapes I'd seen moving through the blizzard didn't disappear. If anything, they became clearer now that the storm was calming, more defined and purposeful in their movements. They were still circling our cabin, but their pattern had changed. Instead of the predatory stalking I'd witnessed before, they now moved in what looked almost like a ceremonial dance, a ritual of acknowledgement and acceptance. Ezekiel released his grip on Constance's shoulders and sank back into his chair, his face aged 10 years in the span of 10 minutes. What have you done to our family? He whispered, his voice broken with grief and fear. What kind of legacy are you leaving for our children and grandchildren? Constance cradled baby Samuel against her chest. Her movements gentle and loving, but there was something different about her now. She carried herself with a new kind of authority, a confidence that seemed to come from knowledge of secrets that ordinary folks weren't meant to know. When she spoke, her voice had a musical quality to it, like she was singing instead of talking. But underneath that melody was something that made my skin crawl. I've ensured our survival, Ezekiel, she said, rocking Samuel back and forth with practiced ease. I've made certain that our bloodline will continue, that our children will grow up strong and protected. The price is steep, yes. But it's a price that only comes due once every 3 generations. Most of our descendants will live normal, happy lives, never knowing about the bargain that protects them. And what about the ones who do have to pay? My father, William, asked. his young voice cracking with emotion. "What about Abigail? What's going to happen to her when she comes of age?" Constance looked at me again with those strange, knowing eyes, and I felt something pass between us, a connection, a recognition. Like she was seeing something in me that I didn't even know was there yet. "Abigail will be prepared," she said simply. "When the time comes, she'll understand what needs to be done. The gift runs strong in her, stronger than it ran in me. She'll be able to handle the responsibility." Over the following days, as the snow melted and life in our remote cabin returned to something resembling normal, I began to notice changes in my grandmother that went beyond just her new confidence and authority. She seemed to know things she shouldn't know, when storms were coming days before they arrived, when animals were sick or injured even when they showed no outward signs. When people were going to die sometimes weeks before their time came, she started teaching me things that no 7-year-old should learn: how to read the signs in tea leaves and bird flights, how to listen to the whispers that came on the wind at twilight, how to see the thin places where the world of the living touched the world of the dead. She called it preparing me for my inheritance, but even as a child, I could sense that there was something darker lurking beneath her gentle instruction. The most unsettling change was in how animals reacted to her. Horses that had known her for years would shy away when she approached, their eyes rolling white with fear. Dogs would whimper and hide when she came near, and even the barn cats that had always been friendly would arch their backs and hiss like they were facing down a mountain lion. But it was the way she talked to things that weren't there that truly frightened me. I'd catch her having conversations with empty air, nodding and responding to voices that only she could hear. Sometimes she'd laugh at jokes that nobody had told, or she'd argue with invisible companions about matters that made no sense to anyone listening. "Who are you talking to, Grandmama?" I asked her one evening as we sat by the fire, me working on my letters, and her having what appeared to be an animated discussion with the shadows dancing on the wall. Oh, she looked at me with surprise, like she'd forgotten I was there. "Oh, just old friends, child," she said, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Friends who've been with our family for a very long time. You'll meet them yourself someday, when you're ready." That night, I lay in my small bed listening to the sounds of the cabin settling around me, and I heard Constance moving around downstairs long after everyone else had gone to sleep. I crept to the top of the stairs and peered down through the railings, watching as she performed what looked like some kind of ritual in front of the fireplace. She had drawn symbols on the floor with what looked like salt or chalk, complex patterns that hurt my eyes to look at directly. She was speaking in that strange language I'd heard during the storm, her voice rising and falling in rhythms that seemed to match the beating of my own heart. And standing around her, barely visible in the flickering firelight, were the same dark shapes I'd seen outside during the blizzard. They were inside our home now, part of our daily lives. Invisible guardians or overseers that watched everything we did and reported back to whatever power had made the bargain with Constance. I realized then that the price she'd paid wasn't just something that would come due in the future. It was something that was being paid every single day, in small increments, changing our family in ways that we were only beginning to understand. As the weeks turned into months after that terrible winter night, I began to understand that the changes in our family went far deeper than just Constance's strange new abilities and the invisible presences that seemed to follow her everywhere she went. The bargain she'd made had created ripples that spread outward like stones thrown into still water, affecting not just our immediate household, but everyone who came into contact with us. The first sign that something was fundamentally different came when spring arrived and the traveling preacher, Reverend Josiah Mills, made his annual circuit through our remote area. Reverend Mills had been coming to our cabin for 3 years running, holding services for the scattered homesteaders who lived too far from any established church to attend regular worship. He was a good man, gentle and kind, with a gift for making even the most hardened frontiersman feel welcome in the presence of the Lord. But when he arrived that April morning, riding his old mule up the muddy path to our cabin, he stopped short about 50 yards from our front door. I watched from the window as he sat there on his mule, staring at our home with an expression of confusion and growing alarm. His usually cheerful face had gone pale, and I could see his lips moving in what looked like urgent prayer. After several minutes, he dismounted and approached the cabin on foot, but his steps were hesitant, like a man walking through a graveyard at midnight. When Constance opened the door to greet him with her usual warm smile, Reverend Mills actually took a step backward, his hand instinctively reaching for the silver cross that hung around his neck. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice strained and uncertain, I'm not sure I should be here. There's something different about this place, something that makes my soul feel uneasy." Constance's smile never wavered, but I caught a flash of something cold and calculating in her green eyes. "Why, Reverend Mills, whatever do you mean?" "We're the same God-fearing family we've always been. Won't you come in for some coffee and biscuits? I'm sure you're tired after your long ride." But Reverend Mills shook his head, backing away from the door like it was the entrance to hell itself. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore, but I can't. There's a darkness here that I can feel in my bones, a presence that has no business in a Christian home. I'll pray for you and your family, but I cannot in good conscience set foot inside your dwelling." He mounted his mule and rode away, without another word, leaving us standing in the doorway watching his retreating figure disappear into the forest. That was the last time any preacher ever came to our cabin, and word spread among the scattered homesteads that the Whitmore place was somehow cursed or tainted. The isolation that followed was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it meant that fewer people witnessed the strange things that continued to happen around Constance. On the other hand, it meant that when I needed help understanding what was happening to our family, there was no one I could turn to for guidance or support. It was during this time of isolation that I found my first ally in the most unexpected place. Her name was Morning Star, and she was a Cheyenne woman who lived alone in a small wickiup about 5 miles from our cabin. Most of the white settlers in the area avoided her, partly out of racial prejudice and partly because she had a reputation for knowing things about the spirit world that made folks uncomfortable. I met her by accident one day when I was out gathering wild berries and got turned around in the forest. I was only 8 years old, and the woods seemed to close in around me like the walls of a prison. I was starting to panic when I heard a voice speaking in accented English from somewhere behind me. "Lost child should not wander so far from home when the spirits are restless," the voice said, and I turned to see a woman of perhaps 40 years. Her long black hair streaked with silver, and her dark eyes filled with a wisdom that seemed ancient. Beyond her years, Morning Star didn't just help me find my way home, she walked with me partway, and during that walk, she said things that made my young heart race with recognition and fear. "Your grandmother has made a bargain with the shadow people," she said matter-of-factly, like she was commenting on the weather. "Such bargains always come with a price that extends beyond the one who makes them. How do you know about that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because I can see the marks they have left on you, child. The shadow people have claimed you as their own. But you are not yet ready to understand what that means. When the time comes, when the burden becomes too heavy to bear alone, you will find me. I will teach you what your grandmother cannot, how to walk between the worlds without losing your soul." She left me at the edge of our property, but not before pressing something into my small hand, a small pouch made of soft leather and filled with what felt like dried herbs and small stones. "Keep this with you always," she said. "It will not protect you from your destiny, but it will help you remember who you are when the darkness tries to claim you completely." That pouch became my most treasured possession, and I wore it on a cord around my neck, hidden beneath my clothes where Constance couldn't see it. Somehow, I knew instinctively that my grandmother wouldn't approve of my connection to Morning Star, that there were things the Cheyenne woman knew that Constance didn't want me to learn. As the months passed, I began to notice that I was changing. 2. Developing abilities that no 8-year-old should possess. I could sense when people were lying, could feel their emotions like physical sensations pressing against my skin. I started having dreams that came true, visions of events that would happen days or weeks in the future. And most disturbing of all, I began to see the dead. They appeared to me as translucent figures, usually at twilight when the boundary between day and night was thinnest at first. They were just glimpses out of the corner of my eye, a woman in a faded dress standing by the well, an old man sitting on our front porch smoking a pipe that cast no smoke. But gradually, they became clearer, more persistent, until I could see them as clearly as I could see the living. The worst part was that they seemed to know I could see them. And they would try to communicate with me, reaching out with ghostly hands and moving their lips in silent pleas for help or attention. I learned to avoid looking directly at them, to pretend I couldn't see them, but the effort of ignoring them was exhausting and left me feeling drained and hollow. Constance noticed my growing abilities, of course, and she began to intensify my training. She taught me to read the patterns in smoke and flame, to interpret the messages carried on the wind, to understand the language of dreams and omens. But there was always something she held back, some crucial piece of knowledge that she kept to herself. "Patience, child," she would say when I asked too many questions. "All will be revealed when you're ready. The shadow people have their own timeline, their own way of doing things. We must respect their wisdom and wait for their guidance." But I was beginning to suspect that Constance's relationship with these shadow people wasn't as simple as she made it seem, and that the price of her bargain was higher than she'd ever admitted to the rest of the family. Everything came to a head on my 9th birthday, child, when Constance decided it was time for me to undergo what she called the awakening ceremony. I'd been dreading this day for months, ever since she'd started dropping hints about a special ritual that would fully activate my inherited abilities and formally introduce me to the shadow people who'd been watching over our family since that terrible winter night. The ceremony was set to take place at midnight on the night of the new moon, when the darkness would be at its deepest and the veil between worlds would be at its thinnest. Constance spent days preparing, gathering strange herbs from the forest, drawing complex symbols on the floor of our root cellar with what looked like a mixture of salt and ash, and speaking in hushed tones with the invisible presences that followed her everywhere. My father, William, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the changes in our household, and he tried to intervene on my behalf. "Ma, she's just a child," he pleaded with Constance as we sat around the dinner table that evening. "Can't this wait until she's older? Until she can make her own choice about whether she wants to be part of whatever this is?" But Constance's response chilled me to the bone. "The choice was made long before Abigail was born," she said, her voice carrying that strange musical quality that had become more pronounced over the months. "The shadow people don't negotiate with children, William. They expect their due when the time comes, and the time has come." That night, as the clock on the mantel chimed midnight, Constance led me down into the root cellar where she'd prepared her ritual space. The symbols she'd drawn on the earthen floor seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and the air was thick with the scent of burning herbs that made my head feel dizzy and strange. But as we descended those wooden steps, I felt the leather pouch that Morning Star had given me grow warm against my chest, and suddenly I could see things that Constance couldn't see. The shadow people she'd been communing with weren't the benevolent guardians she believed them to be, they were something far more sinister. Creatures of pure hunger and malice that had been feeding off our family's life force for months. The truth in that moment, clear as daylight despite the darkness surrounding us. The bargain Constance had made hadn't saved baby Samuel's life, it had simply delayed his death while these creatures slowly drained the vitality from our entire family. Samuel was growing up healthy and strong, yes, but at the cost of years. Being stolen from the rest of us, Ezekiel had aged dramatically since the winter, his hair going white and his back bending under the weight of premature old age. William looked haggard and worn despite being barely 19, and Constance herself, though she tried to hide it with her newfound confidence, was becoming something less than human with each passing day. The shadow people weren't interested in maintaining any balance between life and death. They were parasites, feeding off human suffering and growing stronger with each generation they corrupted. The service they expected from every third generation wasn't a noble calling or a sacred duty, it was slavery, pure and simple. "Grandmama," I said, my voice trembling with the weight of this terrible revelation. "These aren't the beings you think they are. They're not here to help us, they're here to consume us." Constance turned to look at me with eyes that were no longer entirely her own, and I saw something that broke my heart. Deep beneath the alien intelligence that had taken up residence, behind her green eyes, I could see a flicker of the woman she'd once been, confused, frightened, and desperate to understand what had happened to her family. "What are you talking about, child?" she asked, but her voice lacked its usual certainty. "They saved Samuel. They've protected our family. They've given us gifts beyond imagination." "They've given us curses disguised as gifts," I replied, clutching Morningstar's pouch so tightly that the small stones inside bit into my palm through the leather. "Look round you, Grandmama. Really look. See what they've done to Grandfather, to Papa, to you. This isn't protection, it's slow murder." For a moment, the ritual space fell completely silent except for the sound of our breathing and the distant howling of wind through the trees above. Then, gradually, I became aware of other sounds, whispers in that ancient language, growing louder and more insistent. Filled with anger at having their deception exposed, the shadow people materialized around us, no longer bothering to hide their true nature. They weren't the elegant, mysterious figures Constance had been seeing. They were twisted, hungry things with too many teeth and eyes like burning coals. Their forms shifted and writhed like smoke. But there was nothing insubstantial about the malevolence that radiated from them in waves. "The child sees too much," one of them hissed, its voice like the sound of dead leaves scraping against stone. "She carries protection that was not part of our bargain. The old woman of the forest has interfered with our plans." Constance looked around in horror as she finally saw her benefactors for what they truly were. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and she staggered backward against the cellar wall, her hand pressed to her mouth in shock and revulsion. "What have I done?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, dear God in heaven, what have I done to my family?" That's when the shadow people dropped all pretense of civility and revealed their true intentions. They hadn't come to collect me for some ceremonial awakening. They'd come to claim me completely, to turn me into another puppet like they'd been slowly turning Constance. The ritual wasn't meant to activate my abilities, it was meant to strip away my humanity and make me into a vessel for their hunger. The bargain stands, the largest of the creatures declared, its form towering over us like a living nightmare. "The child belongs to us now. She will serve as her grandmother has served, and her descendants will serve in turn until the end of time itself." But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the power of the protection Morningstar had given me. And they'd underestimated The strength that comes from finally seeing the truth, no matter how terrible that truth might be. The moment I spoke those words about seeing the truth, the shadow creatures turned their full attention to me. And I felt the weight of their malevolent focus like a physical force pressing down on my small shoulders. The air in the root cellar grew thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath misting in the candlelight. The child has been corrupted by the forest witch, the largest shadow creature snarled, its form writhing with barely contained rage. She carries charms and protections that were not part of our agreement. This is a violation of the sacred contract. Constance, still reeling from the revelation of what she truly bargained with, tried to step between me and the creatures, but her movements were sluggish and uncertain, like she was fighting against invisible bonds that held her in place. Please, she begged, her voice breaking with desperation. If I've been deceived, if I've made a terrible mistake, surely we can find another way. Take me instead, let the child go free. But the shadow people weren't interested in renegotiating their deal. They'd been feeding off our family for months, growing stronger with each passing day, and they weren't about to give up their prize now that they were so close to claiming it completely. The bargain was made with full knowledge of the consequences. Another creature hissed, its voice like the sound of wind through a graveyard. Ignorance is not an excuse for breach of contract. The child will serve, as was agreed, or the entire bloodline will pay the price for your defiance. That's when I understood the true scope of the trap Constance had walked into. The shadow people hadn't just claimed me, they'd claimed every future generation of our family. If I refused to serve, if I somehow managed to break free from their control, they would hunt down every Whitmore descendant until they found one willing to take my place. My future children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, all of them would be at risk because of the choice my grandmother had made in a moment of desperate love. The creatures began to circle us, their forms growing more solid and menacing. With each step, I could feel their hunger like a living thing, pressing against my mind and trying to find a way inside. They whispered promises of power and knowledge, threats of pain and suffering, anything they thought might break down my resistance and make me submit to their will. But Morning Star's pouch grew warmer against my chest, and I found strength I didn't know I possessed. I won't let you hurt my family, I said, my young voice carrying a conviction that surprised even me. I won't let you turn me into another puppet for your evil games. The largest creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the screams of the damned. You have no choice, little one. The contract is binding, sealed with blood and witnessed by powers older than your civilization. You belong to us now, body and soul. That's when Constance did something that changed everything. Drawing on reserves of strength and love that the shadow people hadn't been able to corrupt, she threw herself between me and the creatures, her arms spread wide to shield me from their advance. No, she screamed, her voice echoing off the cellar walls with surprising power. I made the bargain, I'll pay the price, but I won't let you have her. I won't let you destroy another generation of my family. The shadow people recoiled from her sudden defiance, clearly not expecting this kind of resistance from someone they'd been controlling for months, but their surprise quickly turned to rage. And they began to advance on both of us with renewed fury. Then you will both serve, the largest creature declared, its form towering over us like a living nightmare. The grandmother as punishment for her defiance, the child as payment for the original debt. Your suffering will be legendary, even among our kind. The cellar filled with an otherworldly howling as more shadow creatures poured through the walls, like smoke, surrounding us completely. I could feel their hunger pressing against my mind, trying to find cracks in my defenses, ways to worm their way into my thoughts and take control of my will. But just when it seemed like all hope was lost, I heard a familiar voice calling from somewhere above us. "Abigail, where are you, child? I've come to help." It was Morning Star. And somehow she'd found our cabin despite the darkness and the supernatural forces that should have kept her away. Her voice cut through the howling of the shadow creatures like a blade through silk, and I felt a surge of hope that maybe, just maybe, we weren't as alone as we'd thought. The shadow people heard her too, and their rage intensified to a level that made the very air around us crackle with malevolent energy. "The forest which comes to interfere," one of them snarled. "She cannot be allowed to disrupt our claiming ceremony." But Morning Star was already descending the cellar steps, her presence like a beacon of light in the supernatural darkness. She carried with her the scent of sage and sweet grass, and the shadow creatures actually retreated a few steps as she entered their domain. "You have no power here, old woman," the largest creature declared, but there was uncertainty in its voice. Now, a note of fear that hadn't been there before. Morning Star smiled, and in that smile I saw the wisdom of ages and the strength of someone who'd spent her entire life walking between worlds. "Perhaps not," she said calmly, "but I know someone who does." Morning Star's words hung in the air like a promise and a threat all rolled into one, and I could see the shadow creatures hesitate for the first time since they'd revealed their true nature. They were ancient beings, older than human civilization. But there was something about the Cheyenne woman's calm confidence that made them uncertain, like she knew secrets they'd forgotten, or powers they'd underestimated. "What do you mean, old woman?" the largest creature demanded, its form writhing with barely contained fury. "What power could you possibly possess that would concern beings such as ourselves?" Morning Star reached into a leather pouch at her waist and withdrew something that made the shadow creatures recoil as if she'd pulled out a burning brand. It was a small piece of bone, carved with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the candlelight, covered with markings that predated any written language I'd ever seen. "This is a calling bone," she said, her voice carrying the weight of ancient authority. "It was carved from the rib of the first shaman, blessed by spirits that walked the earth when your kind were nothing more than whispers in the void. With this, I can summon the old ones, the guardians who are set in place to keep creatures like you from preying on the innocent." The shadow creatures began to back away, their forms becoming less solid, more uncertain. I could feel their fear, like a living thing, pressing against the walls of the cellar and making the very air tremble with their anxiety. "You wouldn't dare," one of them hissed. But there was desperation in its voice now instead of the arrogant confidence it had displayed before. "The old ones have not walked this realm for centuries. They have forgotten the world of mortals, have they?" Morning Star asked, raising the bone to her lips. "Shall we find out?" But before she could use whatever power the bone contained, Constance suddenly collapsed to her knees, her body convulsing as if she were having some kind of seizure. The months of being slowly drained by the shadow creatures had taken a terrible toll on her, and the stress of finally seeing the truth about her bargain was more than her weakened system could handle. "Grandmama," I cried out, dropping to the floor beside her and taking her cold hand in mine. Her skin was grey as ash, and her breathing was shallow and laboured, like each breath might be her last. The shadow creatures saw their opportunity in Constance's collapse, and they pressed forward again, their hunger overriding their fear of Morning Star's threats. "The old woman dies," the largest one declared with satisfaction. "Her life force has been ours to harvest for months, and now we claim the final payment when she passes. The child will have no choice but to serve in her place." That's when I realized the full horror of what had been happening to our family. The shadow creatures hadn't just been feeding off our vitality, they'd been slowly killing Constance, draining her life force bit by bit while making her believe she was gaining power and knowledge. The bargain she'd made to save baby Samuel was going to cost her everything, and when she died, the debt would pass to me. There has to be another way, I pleaded with Morning Star. Tears streaming down my face as I watched my grandmother's life ebbing away before my eyes. Please, you have to help her. You have to save her. Morning Star knelt beside us, her weathered hands gentle as she examined Constance's failing form. Child, she said softly, your grandmother's spirit has been bound to these creatures for too long. The damage they've done goes deeper than flesh and blood. They've been consuming her very essence, her connection to the world of the living. But you can fix it, can't you? I asked desperately. You have magic, you have power, you can break their hold on her. Morning Star's expression was filled with compassion and sorrow as she shook her head. Some wounds cannot be healed, little one. Some prices, once paid, cannot be refunded. Your grandmother made her choice out of love, but love alone is not enough to undo the consequences of dealing with beings like these. The shadow creatures pressed closer, sensing victory within their grasp. The old woman's death will complete the binding. One of them whispered with malicious glee. The child will be ours completely, with no one left to protect her or guide her resistance. But Constance, even in her dying moments, had one last act of defiance left in her. With tremendous effort, she raised her head and looked directly at me, her green eyes blazing with the fierce love that had driven her to make the original bargain. Abigail, she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with desperate urgency, listen to me carefully. The bargain, it has a loophole. Every contract with the shadow people has one weakness, one way out that they never tell you. About what? Is it, Grandmama? I asked, leaning close to catch her fading words. The debt can be transferred, she gasped, her breathing becoming more labored with each word. Not to another person, but to the land itself. If you can bind the creatures to a specific place, trap them in a location where they cannot leave, the bloodline debt is broken. The shadow creatures realized what she was revealing and surged forward with renewed fury. But Morning Star raised the calling bone and spoke a single word in a language that predated human speech. The creatures froze in place, held back by power they couldn't overcome, but I could see the effort was costing Morning Star dearly. Tell me how, I begged Constance. Knowing we had only moments before her strength gave out completely, the symbols in the root cellar, she whispered, they're not just for summoning, they're a binding circle, if you can. If you can complete the pattern and speak the words of entrapment, you can lock them here forever. With her last breath, she whispered the ancient words I would need. Syllables that burned themselves into my memory like brands on cattle hide. Then she was gone, her spirit finally free from the shadow creature's influence, leaving me alone with the terrible knowledge of what I had to do. The weight of Constance's final words settled on my 9-year-old shoulders like a mountain of responsibility I wasn't sure I could bear. The binding circle she'd drawn on the cellar floor was incomplete, missing crucial elements that would trap the shadow creatures forever. And I was the only one left who knew the words needed to complete the ritual. Morning Star was still holding the creatures at bay with her calling bone. But I could see the strain it was putting on her, sweat beaded on her weathered forehead, and her hands trembled with the effort of containing beings that had grown fat and powerful on months of feeding off my family's life force. Child, she said through gritted teeth, whatever you're going to do, you must do it quickly. I cannot hold them much longer, and when my strength fails, they will be free to claim you completely. The shadow creatures sensed her weakening resolve, and began to press against the invisible barrier she'd created, their forms writhing with anticipation. The forest witch grows tired, one of them taunted. Soon her primitive magic will fail, and we will feast on both your souls as punishment for your defiance. I looked at the incomplete binding circle on the floor, trying to remember everything Constance had taught me about symbols and their meanings. The pattern was complex, a web of interconnected lines and curves that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, but there were gaps in the design, places where crucial elements were missing. With shaking hands, I began to complete the pattern. Using a piece of chalk I found among Constance's ritual supplies, each line I drew seemed to burn with cold fire. And I could feel the shadow creature's rage intensifying as they realized what I was attempting to do. You cannot bind us, little one, the largest creature snarled, its form towering over me like a living nightmare. We are older than your world, more powerful than your comprehension. Your grandmother's feeble magic is nothing compared to our ancient strength. But as I continued to work, adding the missing elements to the binding circle, I began to feel something else, a presence that wasn't malevolent or hungry, but protective and loving. It was Constance's spirit, freed from the shadow creature's influence by death, and she was guiding my hand as I completed the pattern she'd started. That's it, child. I heard her voice whisper in my mind, as clear as if she were standing right beside me. You're doing beautifully. Just a few more lines, and the trap will be complete. The shadow creatures realized what was happening and made a desperate attempt to break through Morningstar's barrier, but the Cheyenne woman spoke another word of power, and they were forced back once again. However, the effort cost her dearly, and she collapsed to her knees, the calling bone slipping from her fingers and clattering across the floor. Now, Abigail, Morningstar gasped. Speak the words while the circle is still active. I opened my mouth to recite the ancient syllables Constance had whispered to me with her dying breath. But nothing came out. The words were there in my memory, burned into my mind like fire, but my throat seemed frozen with fear and the magnitude of what I was attempting. The shadow creatures, sensing their opportunity, surged forward with renewed fury. The child hesitates, one of them hissed with malicious glee. She lacks the strength and conviction to complete the binding. She will be ours after all. They were right to sense my fear, child. I was just 9 years old, facing creatures of unimaginable evil and power, trying to perform magic that seasoned practitioners would have found challenging. The weight of my family's future, of all the generations that would come after me, pressed down on my small shoulders like a physical force. But then I felt something warm against my chest, Morningstar's protective pouch. The one she'd given me when I was lost in the forest. The herbs and stones inside seemed to pulse with their own life, reminding me that I wasn't alone in this fight. That I carried the strength and wisdom of those who had come before me. I can't do this, I whispered, tears streaming down my face as the shadow creatures pressed closer. I'm not strong enough. I'm not brave enough. That's when I heard another voice, not Constance's spirit, but something deeper and older, the voice of the land itself. Of all the generations of my family who had lived and died on this frontier soil, you are stronger than you know, little one, the voice said. You carry the blood of survivors, the spirit of those who carved life from wilderness. Trust in that strength, and speak the words that will set your family free. But even as I tried to find my courage, the shadow creatures broke through the last of Morningstar's defenses and surrounded me completely. Their cold touch burned like ice against my skin, and I felt their hunger pressing against my mind, trying to find a way inside. It's too late, the largest creature declared with triumph. The binding is incomplete, the words unspoken. The child belongs to us now and through her. We will claim every future generation of this bloodline. I closed my eyes and prepared for the end, knowing I had failed my family and doomed all my descendants to the same fate that had befallen Constance. The shadow creature's laughter echoed through the cellar like the sound of breaking glass, and I felt their cold presence. beginning to seep into my very soul. But just when all seemed lost, when the shadow creature's cold touch was beginning to seep into my very soul, I felt something unexpected, a surge of warmth and strength that came not from outside, but from within. It was the combined power of all the women in my bloodline, all the mothers and grandmothers who had faced impossible odds and found ways to protect their families. I could feel them with me in that moment, not as spirits like Constance, but as living memories. As the courage and determination that had been passed down through generations of frontier women who had carved lives from wilderness and refused to let anything destroy what they'd built. "You are not alone, child," I heard them whisper in voices that sounded like wind through prairie grass. "We are with you. We have always been with you. Use our strength, speak our words, and set our bloodline free with this newfound strength." Flowing through me, I opened my eyes and looked directly at the largest shadow creature. "You're wrong," I said, my voice steady despite my fear. "The binding isn't incomplete. And it's not too late. You made one crucial mistake. You underestimated the power of love that refuses to surrender." I raised my hand and spoke the ancient words Constance had whispered to me, but now they came out clear and strong, each syllable ringing through the cellar like a bell tolling for the dead. The binding circle on the floor blazed with brilliant white light, and the shadow creatures found themselves trapped within its confines, unable to escape the prison I had completed. "This is impossible," the largest creature shrieked, its form writhing against invisible bonds. "The child lacks the power to bind us. She is nothing but a mortal girl. I am a mortal girl." I agreed, continuing to speak the words of binding even as the creatures raged against their prison. "But I am also the daughter of survivors, the granddaughter of pioneers, the great-granddaughter of women who crossed oceans and mountains to build new lives. I carry their strength in my blood, their courage in my heart, and their love in my soul." The binding circle grew brighter with each word I spoke, and I could see the shadow creatures beginning to fade, their forms becoming less solid as the ancient magic took hold. They had fed off our family's life force for months, but now that stolen energy was being returned to its rightful place, flowing back into the land itself where it belonged, Morning Star, who had been watching from where she'd collapsed, managed to pull herself to her feet, and at her voice to mine, she spoke in her native tongue, words of power that complemented the binding spell and made it even stronger. Together, we wove a prison of light and will that the shadow creatures could never escape. "You cannot hold us forever," one of the creatures hissed, its voice growing weaker as the binding took hold. "We are eternal. We will find a way to break free, perhaps," I said, speaking the final words of the binding spell, "but not in my lifetime or my children's lifetime or their children's lifetime. You wanted to feed off my bloodline for generations to come. Instead, you'll spend those same generations trapped in this place, powerless to harm anyone ever again." The binding circle flared one final time, and then the shadow creatures were gone, not destroyed, but imprisoned in a place between worlds where they could do no more harm. The cellar fell silent except for the sound of our breathing and the distant whisper of wind through the trees above. Morning Star helped me to my feet, her weathered hands gentle on my shoulders. "You did well, little one," she said, her voice filled with pride and relief. "You found the strength to break a cycle that could have enslaved your family for generations." I looked down at Constance's still form, and I felt a profound sadness mixed with gratitude. She had made a terrible mistake, but she had also given me the knowledge I needed to fix it. Her love for baby Samuel had led her astray, but in the end, that same love had provided the key to our salvation. What happened next was both terrible and beautiful to witness, child. The binding spell I had woven with Morning Star's help didn't just trap the shadow creatures, it began to unravel all the dark mag ick they had woven into our lives over the months since Constance's bargain. The stolen life force they had drained from our family came flooding back like water breaking through a dam, and I could feel the very air around us changing, becoming lighter and cleaner. The cellar filled with a warm, golden light that seemed to emanate from the binding circle itself, and in that light I could see the spirits of all the people the shadow creatures had harmed over the centuries. They weren't the tortured, enslaved souls I had glimpsed before, but free spirits finally able to find peace after being trapped in darkness for so long. Among them, I saw Constance's spirit. But she looked different now, younger, healthier, more like the grandmother I remembered from before that terrible winter night. The grey pallor was gone from her ethereal form, replaced by the warm glow of someone whose soul had been cleansed of corruption. "Thank you, my dear child," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the supernatural light. "You have done what I could not. You broke the cycle of darkness that would have claimed our family for generations to come. The shadow creatures are bound now, trapped in a prison of their own making, unable to harm anyone ever again. But the most remarkable transformation was happening above us, in the world of the living." I could hear my father William calling out in amazement from somewhere upstairs, and when Morning Star and I climbed out of the cellar, we found him standing in the main room of our cabin, staring in wonder at his own hands. The premature aging that had marked him for months was reversing itself before our eyes. His hair, which had been going grey at 19, was returning to its natural brown colour. The lines of exhaustion and worry that had creased his young face was smoothing away, and his shoulders were straightening as the weight of supernatural oppression lifted from them. "Abigail," he cried when he saw me, sweeping me up in his arms and spinning me around like he used to do when I was smaller. "Something's happened. I feel like myself again for the first time in months. It's like I've been living in a fog, and suddenly the sun has come out." The same transformation was happening to my grandfather Ezekiel, who came stumbling out of his bedroom, looking confused but remarkably healthier than he had in months. His bent back was straightening, his white hair was showing streaks of its original black, and his eyes were clear and bright instead of the dull, lifeless orbs they had become. Even baby Samuel, who had been unnaturally quiet and still since the night of the bargain, began to cry with the healthy, lusty wails of a normal infant. The eerie calm that had surrounded him was gone, replaced by the natural fussiness of a baby who was truly alive instead of sustained by dark magic. But the most profound change was in the cabin itself. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over our home like a shroud was lifting, and I could feel the presence of the shadow creatures fading away like smoke in the wind. The invisible watchers that had monitored our every move were gone, banished to their prison between worlds, where they could no longer interfere with the lives of innocent people. Morning Star watched all of this with the satisfied expression of someone who had seen justice done. "The land itself is healing," she observed, gesturing toward the windows where the first light of dawn was beginning to creep across the horizon. The shadow creatures had been poisoning this place with their presence, but now that they are bound, the natural order is reasserting itself. She was right. Even the wildlife seemed to sense the change. Birds that had been silent for months began to sing, and I could see deer moving freely through the forest instead of avoiding our property like they had been doing since the bargain was made. As the sun rose fully above the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed more beautiful than any sunrise I had ever seen, I felt a profound sense of completion. The terrible burden that had been placed on my young shoulders was lifted, and for the first time in months, I could imagine a future that wasn't overshadowed by darkness and supernatural threat. Constance's spirit appeared to me one final time. As the morning light filled our cabin, she looked peaceful now, ready to move on to whatever realm awaited souls that had found redemption through sacrifice and love. Remember this day, Abigail," she said, her voice fading like an echo in a canyon. "Remember that love can triumph over darkness, that courage can break any chain, and that sometimes the smallest person can make the biggest difference. Tell this story to your children and grandchildren so they will know that our family strength comes not from supernatural gifts, but from the bonds that tie us together." Then she was gone, finally free to rest in peace, leaving me with the knowledge that I had not only saved my family but broken a cycle of darkness that could have continued for generations. That was 75 years ago, child, and I'm the only one left who remembers the true story of how our family broke free from a curse that could have enslaved us for generations. The official family history, the one that gets told at reunions and written in Bibles, says that Constance May Whitmore died peacefully in her sleep after a brief illness. But you and I know the truth now. She died a hero, sacrificing herself to give me the knowledge I needed to save our bloodline from eternal darkness. The years that followed were good ones for our family. My father, William, grew up to be a strong, healthy man who married a wonderful woman named Elizabeth and raised 5 children of his own. My grandfather, Ezekiel, lived to be 93. His mind sharp and his body strong right up until the day he passed peacefully in his sleep. Baby Samuel grew up to be the finest man you ever did see, never knowing how close he'd come to being lost to us forever. None of them ever knew the full truth about what happened that winter night when Constance made her bargain with the shadow creatures. I kept that secret locked away in my heart, just like I've kept so many other secrets over the years. But as I've grown older, as I've watched our family tree grow and flourish, I've come to understand that some secrets are meant to be shared, especially when they carry lessons that future generations need to learn. The gift that Constance spoke of, the ability to see beyond the veil, to sense things that others cannot, it didn't disappear when the shadow creatures were bound. It's still there in our bloodline, passed down from mother to daughter. But now it's a true gift instead of a curse. It comes with wisdom instead of corruption, with protection instead of danger. You have it too, child. I've seen the way you sometimes stare at empty corners, the way you know things you shouldn't know, the way animals trust you instinctively. But don't be afraid of it. The darkness that once threatened to consume our family is gone, trapped forever in a prison of light and will. What you've inherited is clean and pure, a connection to the natural world that can bring healing instead of harm. I've spent these 75 years learning to use my abilities wisely, helping people when I could, always being careful never to make the kind of bargain that Constance made. I've delivered babies who might not have survived without my intervention. I've helped lost souls find their way to peace. And I've protected our family from dangers both natural and supernatural. But, most importantly, I've kept the binding spell strong. Every year on the anniversary of that terrible night, I return to the place where our old cabin once stood. It's nothing but a foundation now, overgrown with wildflowers and blessed by time, and I renew the prison that holds the shadow creatures. It's become a sacred ritual, a responsibility I've carried gladly, because I know what's at stake. The binding will hold as long as someone in our family remembers the truth and maintains the spell. That's why I'm telling you this story now, child. Someday, when I'm gone, that responsibility will pass to you. You'll need to know the words, understand the symbols, and carry on the tradition that keeps our family safe. Don't look so frightened. Dear one, it's not a burden, it's an honor. You'll be the guardian of our bloodline, the keeper of a secret that ensures our children and grandchildren can live free from the darkness that once threatened to consume us. And you won't be alone in this task. Morning Star taught me that there are others like us, other families who've faced similar challenges and found ways to overcome them. There's a whole community of guardians out there, watching over the world and keeping the balance between light and dark. The shadow creatures I bound all those years ago aren't the only ones of their kind, but they were the ones that threatened our family specifically. Others have faced different challenges, different forms of darkness, but the principle remains the same: love conquers fear, courage breaks chains. And sometimes the smallest person can make the biggest difference. I've lived a long life, child. Longer than most folks are blessed to see. I've watched our family grow from a handful of survivors in a remote cabin to a thriving clan spread across 3 states. I've seen children born, couples married, dreams fulfilled, and lives well lived. And through it all, I've carried the knowledge that our happiness and prosperity were bought with courage and sacrifice. Paid for by a 9-year-old girl who found the strength to face down ancient evil. The sun's setting now behind these familiar hills, and I can feel my time growing short. My bones ache with the weight of years and memories, and sometimes I hear voices calling to me from beyond the veil, not the tortured cries of enslaved spirits, but the gentle welcome of loved ones who've gone before. But I'm not afraid. I know that when my time comes, I'll see Constance again, and Morning Star, and all the others who helped me find the courage to break the cycle of darkness. We'll be together again, in a place where no shadow can touch us, where no evil can separate us from the love that binds us together. Until then, I'll keep telling this story, keeping the memory alive, making sure that the truth is passed down to those who need to know it. Because that's what guardians do. We remember, we protect, and we prepare the next generation to carry on the work. Now you know the story my grandmother never wanted told. The secret that's been hidden in our family for 3 generations. It's a heavy burden to carry, but it's also a source of strength. You come from a line of women who faced impossible odds and found ways to triumph. You carry their courage in your blood, their wisdom in your heart, and their love in your soul. Remember this tale, child. Remember it and honor it, but don't let it define you. You are more than just the keeper of family secrets. You are the author of your own story, the creator of your own destiny. Use the gifts you've inherited wisely. Protect those who cannot protect themselves, and always remember that the greatest magic of all is the love that binds families together across time and space. That's the end of my tale, dear one. The fire's burning low, and it's time for an old woman to rest, but the story will live on, as long as there are people willing to listen and remember and carry the truth forward into the light. And that's the most powerful magic of all.